January 17, 1945. Snow had frozen into a thin, glassy crust over the parade ground of the U.S. Army Air Force's training base, crunching under boots as the guards led the prisoner across it. The man in the faded field gray coat kept his eyes lowered, breath rising in pale clouds, wrists wrapped in nothing but worn wool and the memory of handcuffs. He had been told nothing, only that an officer wanted to see him. In his experience, that never meant anything good. Inside the brick classroom, the air was warm and smelled faintly of chalk, oil, and wet canvas. Rows of young American cadets shifted in their seats, flight jackets creaking, eyes narrowing as the door opened. Conversations died mid-sentence. "A German here?" The prisoner hesitated at the threshold, heartbeat loud in his ears. He expected a bare table, a bright lamp. Questions delivered in cold English. Instead, a calm American major picked up a piece of chalk, turned to the room, and spoke clearly. "Gentlemen, this is Oberleutnant Hans Keller," he said. "Former radar engineer, Luftwaffe signals. He's here to teach you how your enemy sees you before you ever see him." Hans blinked at the blackboard, at the waiting faces, and at the silent, glowing radar set in the corner to understand how a prisoner of war ended up at the front of an American classroom. We have to return to the first time Hans Keller watched a radar screen come alive in the darkness. The story of Hans. Keller did not begin in an American classroom, nor in the cold captivity that brought him across the Atlantic. It began years earlier, long before his coat bore the dust of defeat, before his wrists knew the steel of handcuffs back, when he was simply an engineer fascinated by invisible things. Hans was born in Hamburg, the son of a machinist and a school teacher, raised on a steady diet of mathematics, radio tinkering, and responsibility. By the time he graduated from the Technische Hochschule in 1938, Europe trembled on the edge of war. Germany was rearming, expanding, reorganizing at a pace no civilian institution could match. For a young engineer with strong technical instincts and no political loyalties, there was only one direction the tide could carry him: into military research. He was quietly recruited into the Luftwaffe's Funkmisswesen, the signals and detection branch, where whispers circulated about a new technology capable of seeing across darkness, fog, and storms. A technology so secret that it had no formal name in military paperwork, only coded references and locked rooms. Radar. The British were rumored to be developing something similar, but the German scientists, driven by a mixture of pride and pressure, believed they were ahead. Hans found himself assigned to a coastal radar station along the windswept North Sea, tasked with monitoring experimental detection equipment. It was a lonely, meticulous existence, long hours inside concrete bunkers, coils humming, vacuum tubes glowing like orange embers in the dark. He remembered the moment clearly, an October night in 1939. A storm building offshore, the sea restless. Hans sat before the cathode ray tube, its greenish glow reflecting in his tired eyes as the antenna outside swept in slow arcs. And then a tremor. A faint pulse. A single blip on the scope. He leaned forward, adjusting frequencies with careful fingers. The blip became multiple blips. A formation. Approaching from the west, before anyone outside could hear an engine, before any searchlight could catch a reflection, Hans' radar screen whispered the truth. British aircraft fast, low, organized, cutting through the storm. He shouted for the duty officer. Within minutes, German night fighters scrambled. Hans watched their signals diverge from his, saw tracer fire stitch the sky far beyond the bunker walls. He could not see the battle, only the echoes, the measured lines on his scope telling him whether men lived or died. That night was the beginning. The first time he understood the weight of invisible technology. Radar didn't just Detect bombers. It predicted destruction. Through 1940 and 1941, Hans worked night after night as the Luftwaffe expanded its radar network. Towers rose along the coast like metallic skeletons, and the air inside the bunkers grew warm from equipment that hummed relentlessly. Engineers like him became quiet sentinels, watching the war unfold before it arrived, but the pride of innovation soured with the reality of consequence. Hans was not a soldier, yet each blip he identified guided fighters toward real targets, burning planes, dead pilots, shattered families. When he walked home in the gray morning light after long shifts, he could not wash the green glow from his thoughts. By 1942, Allied raids intensified. Night after night, the British sent larger formations, stronger countermeasures, and faster aircraft. Radar stations were bombed regularly. Equipment was repaired under fire, operators working through explosions that rattled their teeth. Hans became one of the specialists called to troubleshoot. He climbed antenna towers during air raids, rewired damaged circuits with numb fingers, and slept in short bursts between bombardments. He was respected but exhausted, technically indispensable, emotionally empty. The early pride of serving scientific progress had evaporated. In its place grew a cold realization. The war was accelerating faster than any machine he could repair, and somewhere deep inside, beneath layers of discipline and duty, he began to fear that Germany's defeat was inevitable. The war was closing in on radar crews like him, squeezing them toward the front lines as the Reich struggled to hold ground. By 1943, the war that had once felt distant to men in bunkers and laboratories had come home. Allied air forces no longer probed cautiously at the edges of Germany. They carved straight lines of destruction across its cities, factories, and railways. Radar crews like Hans were no longer a quiet layer of defense behind the front. They were the front. The Luftwaffe began to pull experienced technicians from the static coastal sites and assign them to mobile radar units, rushed to wherever the situation was most desperate. One morning, Hans stood beside a canvas-covered truck loaded with fragile electronics. Listening to an officer explain that he would be supporting a combined anti-air and ground defense sector in France, he didn't argue. Engineers didn't argue with orders. The unit moved west under gray skies, driving through towns where bomb damage was no longer a rumor but a landscape. Collapsed facades, scorched brick, broken trams lying on their sides like dead animals. They parked their equipment near makeshift airfields, unspooled cables in muddy fields, and raised their antennas like skeletal trees above the hedgerows. Nights were busier than ever. On clear evenings, the radar screen became a dense forest of echoes, Allied bomber streams threading across Europe, escort fighters swirling around them like swift shadows. Hans learned to pick out formations at a glance, to distinguish pathfinder groups from the main force, to guess which city would be hit next from the way the tracks bent. He also learned how quickly the front could move. By mid-1944, after the Allied landings in Normandy, everything began to slide. German forces fell back in stages, then in fragments. Some positions were abandoned in orderly withdrawal. Others were simply overrun. Hans' mobile radar unit lived in the churned-up space between order and chaos. One day, they would be plugging into a command net, reporting bearings and ranges to night fighter controllers. The next, they would be tearing down their gear while artillery thundered closer, jamming delicate machinery into crates not built for haste. He stopped marking locations in his notebook. They changed too quickly. One night, somewhere in the tangle of roads and fields not far from the Belgian border, Hans watched a column of refugees pass under their antenna women. Children, old men dragging carts behind them. The radar hummed on, indifferent. It would show an Allied bomber stream with the same clean sweep of phosphorescent light. The same and different precision. By late 1944, supply lines were failing, fuel was scarce, and the Luftwaffe's presence in the sky thinned. Radar stations still traced paths of incoming raids, but fewer fighters lifted to meet them. Hans sat at his scope and watched bombers cross unhindered. Feeling like a man shouting warnings into an abandoned city, the war was no longer a contest. It was an avalanche. The end, when it came for Hans' unit, arrived during one of those disorganized withdrawals that no communiques ever mentioned. They had been ordered to reposition eastward, a tactical reorientation, the dispatch had called it, but the roads, choked with retreating vehicles, scattered infantry, and damaged equipment, turned every kilometer into a negotiation. Communications were patchy. Maps were outdated. Rumors of American armored spearheads moving faster than expected ran through the ranks like cold wind. At dawn, they parked their trucks in a low field ringed by patches of woodland, intending to rest, repair a failed transformer, and wait for new orders. Hans was under the hood of a generator, hands blackened with grease, when the first distant rumble reached them. At first he thought it was thunder. Then he saw the look on the corporal's face as he dropped his cigarette. American tanks. They emerged not from the front, but from the flank, silhouettes against the pale sky, engines growling. Somewhere along the collapsing line, their column had been bypassed, cut off without ever firing a shot. There was no heroic last stand, no grand speech. An officer shouted a few hurried commands about destroying equipment. Men smashed dials with rifle butts, ripped cables free. Hans took a wrench to the side of the main console, striking until glass and metal shattered. By the time the first American infantry appeared at the tree line, helmets low, rifles raised, the radar set lay in ruins, an artificial corpse in the mud. Hans dropped the wrench, raised his hands, and tasted the metallic fear of the unknown. Interrogation did not come immediately. There were holding fields first, then makeshift pens, then long days of waiting as captured units were sorted, catalogued, and thinned into streams of prisoners sent in different directions. Hans answered basic questions about his rank and function. He gave his name, his unit designation, his specialty. When an American intelligence officer leafed through his file and paused at the word Funkmessengier, the mood in the tent shifted. They did not threaten him. They did not beat him. They simply wrote more notes. Weeks later, he found himself climbing a gangway onto a ship bound west. The Atlantic crossing was a gray blur of cramped berths, salty air, and the endless rhythm of engines. Hans stood at the rail once, under the watchful eye of a guard, and stared at the horizon. He had grown up reading about the ocean as a border. Now it was a wall between him and whatever was left of his home. When America finally appeared, it was not as he had imagined it in propaganda rumors. There were no immediate mobs, no jeering crowds. Just a distant coastline of cranes, warehouses, and an almost unnerving sense of order. He was processed into a POW camp, rows of barracks, barbed wire, watchtowers, and a routine that was strangely predictable. The guards were firm but not sadistic. The food was plain but regular. For the first time in years, he slept without the threat of air raid. Sirens. Yet he never forgot he was still a prisoner. It was in that camp that the first unusual request arrived. American officers had begun quietly sorting through the POW population, identifying those with technical skills, engineers, physicists, ordnance specialists. Hans' name moved along that invisible chain of interest. One afternoon, a lieutenant with neat handwriting and tired eyes called him into a small office. On the table lay copies of his file, the pages marked with underlines. "You worked with radar?" the American asked. "Yes," Hans replied carefully. The questions that followed were not about ideology. They were about wavelengths, ranges, antenna configurations, limitations in bad weather. Hans answered cautiously, sticking to general principles. The lieutenant listened, taking notes, then closed the folder. "There's a training base," he said at last. "Stateside. They're preparing new radar and navigation cadets. The Army Air Forces want them to understand how the enemy thinks." Hans stared at him. "We're considering sending you there," the lieutenant continued. "Not in chains for a quarry or a factory. As a technical advisor. Under guard. Under watch. But in a classroom." The word sounded almost foreign after so many nights in bunkers and fields. Classroom. Hans nodded slowly, not trusting his voice. Weeks later, a truck rolled through a cold, flat American landscape, past fields sleeping under frost and wooden farmhouses with smoke curling from chimneys. Hans sat in the back with two guards, his breath fogging the air. Coat buttoned to the throat, the base appeared as a cluster of hangars, barracks, and runways etched into the earth. Aircraft parked in neat rows, their silver skins dulled by winter light. Signs in English flashed by, crisp and clear. Men in khaki moved with practiced purpose. When the truck halted and the tailgate dropped, Hans stepped down. Boots crunching on frozen gravel. He expected barbed wire, a work detail. Perhaps a warehouse full of crates to inventory. Instead, they led him toward a low brick building with windows glowing softly from within the training wing. Inside, behind a heavy door and beneath humming fluorescent lights, waited a blackboard, a radar console, and rows of young men in uniform. Hans did not yet know it, but from this moment forward, every eye in that room would see him from a different angle. Hans Keller had been many things: a student, an engineer, a soldier without hatred, a man who listened to the hum of vacuum tubes more than the roar of politics. But in the American classroom, he became something stranger, a prisoner standing at the crossroads of two identities. On one side was the German officer he had been trained to be. The uniform, now faded and stripped of insignia, still carried the shape of discipline in its seams. Years of carefully following orders lingered in the way he straightened his posture, in the way he awaited instruction before speaking. On the other side was the engineer, the part of him that could not help but study the radar console in the corner, noticing details instantly: the sweep rate, the arrangement of controls, the voltage hum. He knew the American systems differed from the ones he had used in bunkers along the North Sea, but the language of electronics was universal. He felt a flicker of recognition, a professional curiosity he had not allowed himself in months. Yet trapped between these two selves was something new: uncertainty. Was he betraying his homeland by answering questions? Was he betraying his conscience by staying silent? The Americans watched him closely, not with overt suspicion but with a studied caution. Hans answered slowly, measuring each word. He refused to give away secrets that could harm the men he'd once served with. But he also recognized that some knowledge-broad principles, lessons from experience, could save lives on both sides. Every chalk stroke he made on the blackboard felt like stepping onto thin ice. Every question he answered felt like carrying a weight he could not articulate, and still, when he spoke of wavelengths and echoes and signal decay, his voice steadied. In those moments, he was not a combatant. He was simply a man explaining the invisible. Major Robert Hayes had not expected to stand 2 feet from a German officer and ask him to teach. If anything, he had spent the past 3 years imagining Germans as the faceless threat that had taken his brother's bomber out of the sky over Bremen. He was not a sentimental officer. Hayes had grown up on a farm in Iowa, learned discipline early, and carried himself like a man who trusted routine over emotion. His job at the training base was simple on paper and crushing in practice. Prepare cadets for the war's newest battlefield, the one fought on screens and scopes. when intelligence officers first suggested that a captured German radar engineer might assist in training. Hayes had nearly refused on principle alone. He didn't want the enemy inside his classrooms. He didn't want a man in field gray standing where American instructors had once stood. But war teaches pragmatism with cruel speed. American pilots were dying. Radar was evolving. And the Germans, despite their collapsing front, had developed certain techniques. The U.S. desperately wanted its cadets to understand DOT, so Hayes made a decision he told no one about. He would put aside everything personal if doing so meant his cadets would have even a slightly better chance of surviving their first night mission. When he introduced Hans to the classroom, Hayes watched the cadets' reactions, stiff postures, narrowed eyes, a mix of curiosity and quiet resentment. He felt their distrust as keenly as his own, but as the POW spoke, explaining echo patterns and storm interference, Hayes noticed something unexpected. Hans didn't boast. He didn't posture. He spoke like a tired man trying to translate a language only machines truly understood. Hayes did not trust him, not fully. But he understood him, and sometimes understanding was enough to save lives. The young men seated before Hans Keller were not hardened veterans. They were cadets barely out of high school, some only months into their training. They had memorized flight manuals, practiced instrument approaches, and listened to instructors describe the invisible world of radar. But they still thought of the enemy in simple shapes and sharper emotions. To them, the war was personal. One cadet, Mark Reynolds, clenched his jaw every time Hans spoke. His cousin's B-17 had gone down over northern Germany a year earlier. The family never received a body, only a brief letter and a folded flag. When Reynolds looked at Hans, he didn't see an engineer. He saw the enemy who had guided fighters toward his cousin's bomber. Other cadets were less openly hostile, but no less conflicted. Some whispered to each other when Hans turned to write on the board. Some stared at his uniform with uneasy fascination. A few simply took notes in silence, uncertain if they were supposed to learn from him or merely endure him. Yet something subtle began to shift during that first hour, when Hans explained the concept of ground-controlled interception, drawing the arcs and vectors of aircraft being guided toward targets they could not see. Several cadets leaned forward. When he described how storm cells distorted signals, a few nodded, recognizing their own struggles with bad weather flights. When he traced the shape of a bomber formation on the board, even Reynolds hesitated before looking away. They didn't want to admit it, not even to themselves. But the German prisoner knew things their manuals didn't teach. Knowledge from the enemy felt dangerous, but it was impossible to ignore and beneath their suspicion. A strange truth began to take root. From human conflict to the cold precision of technology, every angle in that room pointed toward one thing. The radar console, waiting silently for its turn to speak. In the corner of the classroom stood the real center of gravity. A radar set humming quietly to itself. Indifferent to flags and uniforms, Hans gravitated toward it between lectures as if pulled by muscle memory. The casing was different from the German sets he had known. Cleaner lines, slightly different layout, but the essence was the same. An antenna somewhere outside swept the sky with pulses of radio energy. Those pulses bounced off whatever they struck: aircraft, terrain, storms, and returned as faint whispers of electricity. On the screen, those whispers became light. Hans explained it simply to the cadets, drawing diagrams with slow, precise strokes. A transmitter sends out a pulse. The pulse travels at the speed of light. If something is out there, part of that energy reflects back. The time it takes to return becomes distance. The angle of the antenna becomes direction. He didn't romanticize it. He didn't make speeches about marvels of science. He just described the way the machine turned empty darkness into measurable information. But as he spoke, The cadets realized something that made the room feel smaller. Radar did not care who used it. It would show an American bomber just as clearly as a German one. It would happily guide a night fighter toward a target or warn a convoy away from danger. It didn't distinguish between offense and defense, only between presence and absence. When the console warmed up and the scope flickered to life, many cadets found themselves staring, imagining what it must have been like for men like Hans to watch the sky fill with blips that meant death was approaching. The machine never judged. It only revealed. Major Hayes was the first to push beyond the technical explanations. It's not enough to know how radar works, he told the class one afternoon, standing beside Hans at the board. You need to know how the enemy uses it. He turned to the POW. Show them. Hans hesitated, then began to sketch the layout of a typical German night fighter control system. On the left, he drew radar stations along the coast. In the center, a control room with large plotting tables. On the right, small icons representing twin-engine night fighters waiting at their airfields. We would detect the bomber stream here, he explained, tapping the coastal radar symbols. Then ground controllers would vector fighters to intersect at altitude. The pilots did not need to see you at first. We told them where to fly. He showed how German controllers created boxes of defended airspace, how they layered searchlights and flak with radar-guided fighters. He described how the British had adapted changing altitudes, varying routes, developing countermeasures to confuse operators like him. The cadets listened more closely than they wanted to admit. Hayes began asking pointed questions. If you were flying into this sector at night, where would you shift altitude to slip between their coverage? If you wanted to overwhelm these controllers, what formation would you use? If your radar fails in storm conditions, how do you think the man on the other side of that screen will react? Hans answered by thinking the way he used to think in cramped bunkers, but this time the mental game was reversed. Instead of hunting bombers, he was showing these young men how to avoid becoming the very blips he once tracked. For the first time, doctrine became something more than diagrams in a manual. It became a contest between minds across an invisible battlefield. At night, when the classroom lights were off and the base settled into a low murmur of distant engines and footsteps on gravel, the moral weight of what he was doing pressed hardest on Hans. In his narrow bunk, under a thin government-issue blanket. He stared at the ceiling and replayed the day's lessons. Equations, diagrams, questions he had answered without hesitation. Other questions he had sidestepped. Back in Germany, the mere idea of instructing the enemy would have been unthinkable. Treason. But Germany as he had known it in lectures halls, quiet laboratories, and evening walks by the Elbe felt as distant as another lifetime. The regime that had dragged the world into fire was collapsing. Cities were crumbling. Families were scattered. What, exactly, was he loyal to now? He told himself that much of what he shared was already known or would soon be discovered. He told himself that understanding radar better might help these Americans avoid catastrophic mistakes, might keep terrified young pilots from smashing into hillsides in storms they couldn't read. Yet a voice inside still whispered, "You are helping them become more efficient. You are making them better at a war that isn't finished." On the American side, the moral debate surfaced in quieter ways. A chaplain passing through the barracks asked Hayes, "Are we right to use them like this?" Hayes replied after a long pause, "If his knowledge keeps one of my boys from dying in bad weather, I'll live with the rest." The cadets had their own unspoken compromises. They disliked Hans. They distrusted him. But they copied his diagrams with a care they didn't show for other lectures, because somewhere ahead waited real missions, real storms, real radar scopes glowing at 2 in the morning. In that uneasy space between resentment and reliance, an unspoken agreement formed. They would accept what he could teach them now. They would decide how they felt about it later. All of these strands: human suspicion, technical insight, tactical doctrine, and moral unease tightened toward an inevitable test. A night when the glowing radar screen would no longer be just a teaching tool, but the only thread connecting a lost aircraft to the ground. Spring crept into the flat American countryside almost reluctantly. Snow retreated in ragged patches, leaving behind wet earth and standing puddles that mirrored the sky. The days grew longer, but on the air base, the hours that mattered still belonged to the dark. Night was when radar truly revealed its character. By April 1945, word had begun to seep into the base from newspapers, radio broadcasts, and letters from home. The Germans were in retreat everywhere. American units had crossed the Rhine. Rumors flew through the barracks. Hitler hiding in a bunker, Berlin encircled, the war in Europe entering its final act. For the cadets in the radar and navigation program, though, the end still felt distant. They had not yet flown their first combat missions. Their war consisted of training schedules, simulator drills, and long evenings in classrooms where chalk scraped across boards and the green radar scope glowed like an artificial moon. Major Hayes believed that as long as one bomber could be shot down by weather, error, or confusion, there was still work to do. That belief shaped the exercise he scheduled for a damp, unsettled night in mid-April. The plan looked simple on paper and complicated in practice. Several training aircraft would take off after dark, each carrying a cadet crew working under the supervision of an instructor pilot. Their tasks would overlap. One plane would simulate an incoming bomber approaching the base from a distance at altitude. Another would fly a holding pattern in a nearby sector, practicing radio navigation fixes. A third would act as a lost aircraft, deliberately flying a prearranged but unknown route, forcing ground controllers to guide it back using radar and radio. In the radar room, cadet operators would take turns at the scope under close supervision, practicing target acquisition and vectoring. It would be a dress rehearsal for the kind of confusion they might later find over Europe or the Pacific. Outside, the weather did not ask permission to participate. Low clouds thickened as the day wore on, dragging ragged gray across the sky. A front was moving in unstable air, patchy rain, and pockets of turbulence. Not a full storm, but enough to make instrument work demanding. A junior officer raised a quiet concern in the planning meeting. "Sir, forecast shows ceilings dropping below 2,000 feet by 2,200 hours. We could push this to tomorrow." Hayes studied the weatherboard in silence. He thought of the reports on his desk: training accidents, pilots who had never seen combat dying in routine flights because they'd only ever practiced in good enough conditions. "If we only train in perfect weather," he said, "they'll meet the real sky unprepared." He signed the authorization. The exercise would proceed. In the radar room, the air was cool and smelled of dust, cable insulation, and the faint tang of coffee gone stale. The equipment had been checked, double-checked, and warmed up. Power readings were steady. The sweep on the scope was smooth. Hans stood off to one side at first, hands clasped loosely in front of him, watching as cadets adjusted dials with varying degrees of confidence. A guard occupied a stool near the door, not intrusive but present, the strap of his rifle snug against his shoulder. The Americans had stopped watching Hans as if he might sabotage their machines. Now they watched him as if he might see something they missed. On the wall, a clock ticked steadily toward 2,100 hours. Cadet Mark Reynolds stepped into the room briefly before his flight, already in gear flight jacket, parachute harness straps hanging loose, helmet under his arm. He glanced at the radar console, then at Hans. Their eyes met for a second. Hans gave the smallest of nods. Not quite a greeting, not quite an apology. Reynolds looked away first, but the hostility in his face had dulled into something more complicated. Without a word, he turned and headed for the hangar where the trainer aircraft waited. "Tonight, "We treat this as if you're working a real sector," Hayes told the gathered cadets in the radar room. "You will positively identify each target, verify altitudes and bearings, and guide them through legs of the exercise. If you're uncertain, you say so. Guessing gets people killed." He let that sit for a moment, eyes moving from face to face. "Mr. Keller will observe," he added, nodding toward Hans. "He'll offer input if he sees something you're missing. That doesn't absolve you of responsibility. It just means you have an extra pair of eyes on your side." The phrase "on your side" landed quietly in the room. Someone dimmed the overhead lights. The scope's glow grew more pronounced, casting green highlights across the faces of the cadets as they took their places. Headsets were adjusted, log sheets laid out, pencils poised dot outside, engines coughed to life on the flight line. The first aircraft lifted off into the murk, then the second, then the third, each disappearing into low cloud as if swallowed by a restless sea. At first, everything unfolded according to plan. A faint return appeared on the edge of the scope as the bomber trainer approached from its designated quadrant. The operator called out range and bearing in a steady voice, the supervising officer nodding approval. Another return emerged closer in. Representing the aircraft in a holding pattern. Hans watched the cadets work their checklists. Their voices over the internal net were a mix of nerves and professionalism. Numbers flowed. Bearings were plotted with grease pencils on the transparent overlay grid. Hayes stood behind them with his arms folded, listening. The weather began to exert its character in subtle ways. Light rain hissed against the roof. Wind gusts shifted Doppler noise along the baseline. At certain angles, ground clutter thickened. Near the scope center, a reminder of hills and structures reflecting energy the way an aircraft might. Then, about 20 minutes into the exercise, the third aircraft checked in, the one that would play the role of Lost. Reynolds' voice came through the speakers, slightly muffled but clear. "Ground, this is Trainer 3, beginning outbound leg. Standing by for radar contact." The operator acknowledged, eyes searching the outer rings of the scope as the sweep rotated. A faint contact appeared, then faded, then reappeared more distinctly on the second pass. Altitude and course were logged. For a while, tracking him was routine. The controller gave minor heading corrections, bringing him into alignment with the planned scenario. Reynolds responded crisply, his tone betraying a focus sharpened by the darkness beyond his windshield. But as the exercise continued, the weather thickened. Ceilings dropped closer to the terrain. Light rain turned intermittent and heavier. Somewhere above the base, turbulence rattled aluminium. Hans noticed the first oddity not in the returns themselves, but in their behavior over time. On one sweep, Reynolds' echo appeared where expected, a clean pip at a predictable range and angle. On the next, it seemed fractionally closer than it should have been. On the third, the contact broadened, smearing slightly in a way that suggested either transitory interference or the edge of a weather cell. He shifted his weight, moving a step closer to the scope. "Do you see that?" he asked quietly, his German accent soft but persistent. The cadet at the console nodded quickly. "Bit of distortion, sir. Possibly just weather. Reading still within acceptable discrepancy." Hans didn't answer at once. The pattern nagged at him, an echo of something he had seen on other nights in another war. With different aircraft and different uniforms, the next sweep aggravated his unease. Reynolds' return was now weaker, its position slightly inconsistent with the heading he'd been given. The operator compensated, offering a new vector. Over the loudspeaker, Reynolds confirmed the turn. A small warning bell rang in Hans' memory. Under certain conditions, turbulent low cloud, mixed precipitation, marginal power fluctuations, radar sets could produce deceptive readings. In the German bunkers, he had watched operators chase phantom positions created by storm cells and ground reflections. Pilots who obeyed those flawed vectors too blindly had sometimes flown into terrain they never saw. Hans glanced at the power gauges. The antenna rotation indicator, the secondary systems. There was a minute fluctuation on one of the power rails, barely enough to trigger formal concern, more than enough to amplify the kind of anomalies he feared. The operator gave another heading change. Trainer 3, come left to 085. Maintain altitude. You're tracking well. Static crackled between words. Reynolds' reply arrived a second late. Copy. Left to 085. Maintaining. On the scope, the contact wavered, its updated position out of sync with the expected track by just enough to trouble inexperienced. Hans felt the hairs rise along the back of his neck. In that small, humming room, illuminated by a single circle of artificial light, he realized that the night's training exercise was sliding, inch by inch, towards something far more dangerous than a drill, and if someone didn't read the pattern correctly, the sky outside would turn from classroom to coffin. Hans had seen this kind of night before. Not in America. Not with English call signs and unfamiliar voices, but in other dark rooms under concrete ceilings that trembled with distant bombs, watching echoes behave in ways that didn't match the neat diagrams in training manuals. He stepped closer to the console, fingers unconsciously tracing the edge of the metal housing. The guard by the door shifted slightly but didn't interfere. Hayes noticed the movement. Keller? The major asked, keeping his voice low. Something wrong? Hans didn't answer immediately. He watched the next sweep. Reynolds' contact appeared again, this time farther off the expected arc than it should have been if his last turn had been accurate. The contact was also flattening, stretching slightly in azimuth, as if something were smearing the reflected signal. In the old bunkers, they'd learned to respect such symptoms. Your power is fluctuating, Hans said at last, gesturing toward the gauge. Not by much, but enough to change how returns behave at longer ranges. Combine that with this weather. He let the implication hang. The cadet at the scope swallowed, suddenly very aware of every dial under his hands. Our calibration checks were within acceptable limits. Sir, the supervising officer interjected, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his tone. Acceptable, Hans repeated softly. Until someone flies into a hill. The room went quieter. On the next sweep, Reynolds' echo dipped closer toward the inner rings. If the range calculation was being distorted, then the numbers the controller was feeding him could be subtly wrong, suggesting a safer margin from terrain than actually existed. Hayes stepped forward. Trainer 3, report altitude, he ordered, nodding to the operator to patch him through. Reynolds' voice came back, tinged with the fatigue of concentration. Altitude holding? 2,000 feet. Some chop. Visibility 0. Only instruments and your voice up there, sir. Hans pictured the countryside around the base. Rolling ground, occasional rises, tree lines invisible in the dark. 2,000 feet was safe enough if the altimeter was correct, if the terrain stayed consistent, if the vectors didn't nudge him toward higher ground. Too many ifs. Another sweep. The contact jumped slightly, a classic signature of returns being bent and scattered by weather. Then misinterpreted by a system leaning on imperfect power. Hans leaned in, eyes narrowing. In Germany, he said quietly, there were nights when the scope lied to us. Not completely. Just enough. We lost pilots we never saw again because we believed the picture more than the pattern. Hayes considered him for one long second. What would you do? The major asked. Hans blinked. Caught for a moment between two worlds, the one where he had guided German fighters through darkness, and this one, where an American cadet's life hung on whether anyone in this room trusted the testimony of a prisoner of war. He pointed at the plotted track on the transparent overlay. Your man is drifting. Not by his fault. Your readings and his instruments are disagreeing. If you keep vectoring him based solely on what you see here, you may be pulling him lower while thinking you're keeping him safe. And your alternative? Hayes pressed. Treat this as storm-contaminated data. Stop giving him small course corrections. Give him a safe, simple heading and altitude that buys time and height. Then guide him home from closer range where the distortion matters less. The supervising officer bristled. With respect, Major, we've run this exercise profile before without. Hayes cut him off with a raised hand. Have you run it in this weather, with a power fluctuation like that? He asked. The officer hesitated. No, sir. The air in the room thickened, filled with the hiss of static and the faint whir of the antenna drive. Hayes made his decision. Patch him through to my station, he ordered. Then to Hans, you think you can read this better than my manuals in conditions like this? Hans met his gaze. I think I have seen this lie before. Hayes nodded once. Then you're going to help bring him back. A headset was placed over Hans' ears. The padded cups felt both familiar and alien. In another life, he had worn similar gear while guiding fighters toward enemy bombers. Now he listened to the hum of the line, the distant crackle of Reynolds' breathing. This is Major Hayes, the American officer said first, voice firm. Trainer 3, we're adjusting your guidance. Stand by for revised instructions. Copy that, Major, Reynolds replied. Glad to hear your voice again. Feels like the sky's getting smaller out here. Hans exhaled slowly, steadying his hands. Let me speak to him, he said. Hayes hesitated, then gestured. Go ahead. Hans pressed the transmit key. Trainer 3, he said, his German accent more pronounced over the wire. This is Keller. You remember me. There was a beat of silence. Then. Yes, sir. Hard to forget. Hans allowed himself the faintest flicker of a smile no one could see. Listen carefully, he continued. Your instruments and our radar are arguing tonight. I want you to trust your altimeter and artificial horizon before you trust any voice on the ground, including mine. Understood? You're not exactly filling me with confidence, sir, Reynolds replied. But there was a trace of strained humor behind the words. If I wanted you dead, Hans said, I would say nothing. That seemed to settle something between them. Point taken, Reynolds answered. Go ahead. Hans studied the scope again, then the terrain map spread on a side table. He had walked this ground only in brief glimpses from truck windows, but he had seen enough to understand its general character. There were no towering mountains, but there were ridges and river valleys that could rise up unexpectedly under a descending aircraft. First, Hans said into the mic, climb. Gentle but steady. I want you at 3,500 feet. Don't chase the instruments. Make them follow you. Smooth hands. Reynolds acknowledged, his voice tightening as he began the maneuver. On the scope, the echo shifted range in a way that didn't perfectly match what Hans expected, but that was the point. The discrepancy reinforced his suspicion that the set was painting a distorted picture at this range and angle. Second, Hans went on, set heading 090. Due east. That keeps you away from the worst of the higher ground. Maintain that until I tell you otherwise. The cadet operator at the console looked uncertain. But, sir, that takes him off the planned approach. The planned approach is written for nights when your equipment is honest, Hans replied without looking away from the screen. Tonight we improvise. Reynolds' voice confirmed the new heading. The echo drifted, not exactly where the geometry said it should be, but close enough. For several long minutes, the room became a study in controlled silence. Hans called for each minor correction with the calm of a man who had guided aircraft through worse storms over darker countries. He ignored small inconsistencies in the returns, focusing instead on trends. Was the signal generally moving closer? Was it staying roughly aligned with the sector where the base lay? Was altitude being preserved? Outside, unseen, the trainer punched through ragged layers of cloud, wings flexing in the invisible turbulence. Inside, pencil marks updated the plot, and sweat beaded along the cadets' hairlines. Trainer 3. Hans said at last, begin a slow turn to heading 060. Descend gradually to 3,000. No more. The base should soon be below and to your left. Reynolds sounded more strained now. Getting some ice on the leading edges. Need to get out of this band. You will, Hans replied. Just keep the nose where it belongs. We are watching you. On the next few sweeps, the contact brightened slightly, a sign of decreasing range. Ground clutter began to build around the center of the scope, the telltale signature of returns, reflecting off buildings and terrain near the base. This was the transition Hans had been waiting for. Now, he murmured, half to himself, now you tell the truth again. The echo responded more predictably at shorter distance. Bearing and range changes matched the transmitted headings with satisfying consistency. Hans refined his instructions, bringing Reynolds into a funnel aimed at the airfield. Descend to 2,500. Reduce speed. You should start seeing a faint glow below when the cloud breaks runway lights. Do not dive for them. In the room, no one moved unnecessarily. Even the guard had unconsciously leaned forward. On the next sweep, the contact was almost on top of the base symbol. Hans keyed the mic one final time. Trainer 3, level at 2,000. Continue straight. You are lined up. When you break cloud, commit. Don't second-guess your line unless your instruments disagree violently. You understand? A long second passed. Then, Roger, Keller. I think I see something through the murk. Looks like yes. Lights, runway lights. Dead ahead. A collective breath seemed to release from the room, a soundless exhale of tension. They could not see the aircraft land from here, but they heard the confirmation a minute later over the radio net. Trainer 3, wheels down. Roll out rough but stable. Back on the ground. Only then did Hans let go of the transmit key. He took off the headset slowly, feeling the indentation it had left against his temples. No one spoke at first. Hayes broke the silence. Log it, he told the supervising officer. All of it. Power fluctuation, weather interference, corrective action, and the fact that we nearly lost a man because we trusted a procedure over a pattern. He turned to Hans. You read it when my boys couldn't, he said quietly. He walks back into this building tonight because you've spent too many nights watching lies on a screen. Hans didn't answer. He simply looked at the fading trace on the scope, the last echo of a crisis that would become, on paper, just another training incident with a footnote, but for everyone in that room, the cadets, the major, the prisoner, it had been something else. It had been the moment when the line between enemy and ally blurred into the shape of a single, fragile radar return. And from that moment on, nothing about Hans Keller's presence on that base could be dismissed as an experiment. He was no longer just a captured engineer. He had become, in a way none of them could yet articulate, part of their survival. For the rest of that night, the base moved with an unusual quiet. Not the ordinary stillness of late hours, but the subdued atmosphere that follows a close brush with disaster. The kind of silence where conversations begin softly, where men check their equipment twice, where every footstep on the corridor floor seems to echo a bit too clearly. Reynolds' trainer aircraft had been towed into the hangar mud splattered along its landing gear. Rainwater streaked across its fuselage. Mechanics ran their hands along the wings, inspecting for stress damage. The instructor pilot who had flown with Reynolds was seen sitting on an overturned crate afterward, helmet beside him, staring at the floor as if replaying every minute. Word of what happened traveled faster than the official memos. Cadets whispered in the hallways. Radar operators, still shaken, replayed the scenario in their heads as they made notes in their logbooks. And everywhere they spoke of the same thing. Major Hayes returned to his office after the debriefing, shut the door, and sat with his elbows on his desk. He had expected to feel relief, and he did, but beneath it lay something heavier. The realization that he had almost lost one of his cadets because they trusted instruments more than instincts. He pulled out the night's files, flipping through the logs. Power fluctuation, minor but real. Weather, marginal and worsening. Trainee responses, mostly correct. Procedure, followed, and yet procedure had nearly killed them. Hayes rubbed his eyes. Keller had been right. And Hayes knew exactly how hard it had been for himself, a U.S. officer, to hand over a live microphone to a German POW, even one who had helped them for weeks. There would be reports to file, explanations to write, a dozen questions from higher up about why a prisoner had been placed in a position to influence a training flight. But none of that changed the truth. If Hans hadn't spoken, Reynolds would not have landed. Hans sat on the edge of his bunk in the small POW quarters assigned to him, still wearing the same coat he had walked in with months earlier. The guard who usually hovered nearby gave him a respectful distance now. Sitting by the far wall reading a newspaper, Hans didn't feel triumphant. There was no pride in saving a man from a danger he had once helped create in another war zone. Just an exhausted clarity. He replayed the radar behavior in his mind, the fluctuations, the distortions, the pattern. He also replayed the hesitation before he spoke up, the long moment when he wasn't sure whether it was his place to intervene. That hesitation troubled him more than anything else. He had not expected visitors this late, but a knock sounded at the barrack door. The guard stood, opened it, and Major Hayes stepped inside. For a moment, the two men just looked at each other. Hayes offered no salute, no crisp military gesture. Instead, he held out something almost shockingly ordinary, a steaming mug of coffee. Hans accepted it carefully, fingers warming around the ceramic. "You did well," Hayes said. "It was the machine," Hans replied softly. "Not me." Hayes shook his head. "No machine warns you when it's lying. Only experience does that." For a long moment, the silence between them was heavy but strangely unhostile. Finally, Hayes said, "I almost didn't give you the mic tonight." Hans nodded. "I almost didn't speak up." The American frowned. "Why?" Hans looked down at the coffee. The steam curled like pale ghosts. "Because I didn't know if it was my place," he answered. "I am your prisoner. And I have helped guide planes before, but not to safety." Hayes considered that, then replied quietly, "Tonight, you were not a German and he was not an American. He was a pilot in trouble, and you were the man who knew how to help." He turned toward the door, but paused before leaving. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow, we adjust the curriculum, and you're part of it." When he left, the guard returned to his chair. Hans sat with the coffee in both hands, absorbing the truth of what had changed. He was still a prisoner. But something invisible had shifted. Respect cautious, reluctant, but real had entered the room. Later, long after the base had gone quiet, another knock sounded so soft that Hans thought he imagined it. This time, when the guard opened the door, Cadet Mark Reynolds stood there, still half in his flight suit. His face was pale from adrenaline and exhaustion. He stepped inside, cleared his throat, and forced himself to meet Hans' eyes. "Sir," he said quietly, I'm not good with words." Hans waited, Reynolds swallowed hard. "You brought me home tonight," he said. "Whatever else we are. I won't forget that." There was no handshake, no dramatic gesture, just a long, steady look between two men who had met on opposite sides of a war and found themselves, for a moment, on the same wavelength. Reynolds nodded once in gratitude, then slipped back into the night. Hans remained seated long after he left, staring at the dark window, listening to the faint hum of distant generators. For the first time since his capture, he felt something like purpose. And with purpose came the certainty that the night's events were only the beginning. Dawn came quietly to the base the next morning. A thin line of pale gold crept across the horizon, touching the hangars, the barracks, the silent radar tower. Most of the cadets slept late after the long night, but the officers did not. There were briefings to attend, paperwork to complete, and decisions to make that would ripple beyond this one isolated training field. For Hans, the day brought no celebration, just a deeper awareness of how fragile the boundary between prisoner and contributor had become. The incident was recorded in the base log as a training irregularity. The technical malfunction minor. Power fluctuation was noted. The weather conditions were detailed. The corrective action taken was described in neutral, almost sterile language, but every officer reading the report understood what those dry phrases truly meant. A trainee aircraft had come within minutes, perhaps seconds, of disaster, and a German POW had been the one to steer it clear. There were quiet meetings behind closed doors. Not arguments, but evaluations. Had they placed too much trust in a prisoner? Had they placed too much trust in their own procedures? And most importantly, should the POW continue to assist? The commanding officer of the base, Colonel March, summoned Hayes to his office. The conversation was short, direct, and surprisingly measured. "You believe this man is an asset?" the colonel asked. "Yes, sir," Hayes replied without hesitation. "And trustworthy?" Hayes paused only for a moment, but long enough to convey the complexity of the truth. "He wants to save lives," he said. "Last night proved that." Colonel March nodded once, made a note, and issued his ruling. Hans would continue in his role with restrictions, but with increased access to the technical staff. It wasn't freedom, but it was no longer mere captivity either. Over the days that followed, the cadets' behavior changed in subtle ways. Where once they muttered under their breath when Hans entered the classroom, now they fell silent in a way that suggested attention, not resentment. They no longer copied his diagrams reluctantly. They asked questions carefully at first, then more openly. How do the German operators handle mixed clutter? What's the worst storm you ever worked through? Why do the echoes smear at shallow angles? Hans answered only what he felt comfortable sharing. He did not reveal classified frequencies or specific vulnerabilities, but he spoke candidly about principles, the lessons only experience can teach. When he drew on the board now, cadets leaned in. Reynolds, once the most suspicious among them, now listened with a focus that bordered on reverence. He did not speak of the night Hans saved his life, not to others, and certainly not in front of him, but the weight of that memory hung in the air, between them like an unspoken pact. Even the guard assigned to Hans, who once stood rigidly alert in every classroom, now relaxed his posture. He still watched, still remained professional, but the tension had eased. Hans felt it in every interaction. He was still an outsider, but he was no longer the enemy. By late April, the atmosphere on the base shifted again, this time from the weight of global events. Berlin was surrounded. German units were surrendering by the tens of thousands. Rumors swirled of Hitler's disappearance, his suicide, his capture. No one knew what was real. When the official announcement came, Germany's unconditional surrender, everything on the base paused. Training was suspended for a day. Men gathered around radios, listening to broadcasts that declared an end to the war in Europe. For Hans, it was not victory. It was finality. He walked outside that evening under the cooling sky, feeling neither joy nor devastation, only the heavy awareness that the country he had known, the one that had raised him, educated him, and misled him, no longer existed in the form he had served. There was no home waiting for him as he remembered it. Only ruins. Only uncertainty. Major Hayes found him standing alone near the fence line. "You'll be processed soon," Hayes said quietly. "Many POWs will be repatriated within months." Hans nodded but didn't turn. "You have options," Hayes added. "I can recommend that you stay for a while, assist with training, engineering work, maybe civilian aviation down the line. Nothing forced. But you're useful here, and we don't waste what works." Hans exhaled slowly. "I would like to help," he said, "but not with weapons." Hayes gave a faint, tired smile. "Then help us keep pilots alive instead." It was not a promise, but it was a path that many German scientists and engineers would quietly take in the years to come as consultants, researchers, teachers, advisors. Hans Keller would not be the most famous among them. But for the men on that base, his impact would be remembered long after the war ended. Weeks later, Hans was given a new set of papers. Not freedom yet, but a change in classification. He would remain under supervision, but he would work directly with the base's technical division to improve radar training standards, focusing particularly on weather anomalies, false echoes, and emergency procedures. The same knowledge that once guided German night fighters would now help keep young American aviators alive. Some might have called it irony. Hans called it balance. Late one afternoon, he looked up from a radar console he was helping recalibrate and watched a civilian airliner glide silently across the distant sky, its passengers unaware of the countless invisible signals guiding them safely home. And in that moment, Hans understood something with absolute clarity. War had turned him into a cog in a machine of destruction. But knowledge, real knowledge, could outlive war. It could be used to build, not break. To save, not take. He had expected chains. Instead, he had been handed a chalkboard, a headset, and a chance to redefine what his skills meant. The war was over, but his purpose had only just begun. The war ended, but the echoes of it lingered quiet, persistent, impossible to fully silence. Hans Keller felt those echoes more keenly than most. They lived not in guilt alone, nor in pride, but in the strange space between, the knowledge that his hands had once guided destruction, and later guided a young pilot safely through a night that should have killed him. In peacetime, the radar screen no longer glowed with the approach of enemy formations. It simply displayed the truth: weather fronts, training flights, the calm rhythm of a sky no longer filled with threat. And as Hans grew older, he realized that radar had taught him a lesson few men ever learned. The waves that reveal danger can also reveal a path home. The same knowledge can be shaped by different intentions. His work at the training base became a blueprint for later programs: techniques on reading storm interference, protocols for distinguishing truth from distortion, methods for preventing pilot disorientation. His name rarely appeared in official documents, but his influence threaded quietly through the next generation of navigators and radar officers. Major Hayes once told him, "Machines don't save people. People do." Hans had not believed him then. Now, he understood that the machine was only a language. It was the human interpreting that language who carried the weight of consequence. Years later, sitting outside on a mild spring day as civilian airliners painted white arcs across the sky, Hans would sometimes imagine the cockpit, a pilot adjusting headings, trusting the invisible signals bouncing across the atmosphere. None of those passengers would know that a German engineer, once a prisoner of their nation, had helped refine the training that kept them safe, and that was enough. War had demanded chains from him. America had offered something else. Purpose. In the end, the chalk in his hand proved stronger than the shackles he feared. Knowledge outlasted conflict. And in the quiet after the storm, Hans discovered that the greatest victories were not won on battlefields or in bunkers, but in moments when enemies chose to learn from one another instead of destroy. It was not forgiveness. It was understanding. And for a man who once expected nothing but captivity, it was a kind of freedom. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us of what it means to be human even in the darkest of times.